Do you want to learn how to build a high quality custom nightstand? Well, stick around because we're getting started right now. Hey, what's up? I'm Mike with woodshopmike.com, and today I'm going to show you how to build this high quality custom nightstand. This piece of furniture is built from reclaimed wormy chestnut. You pair that with the custom turned legs, soft close drawer slides, and a silky smooth finish, you've got yourself a high quality piece of furniture on your hands. And if you want to build some of these for yourself, make sure to hit the link in the description below. I have a full set of plans available that will walk you through every step of the process so you can make some custom nightstands for yourself. Now let's get started. To start off this build, I begin by laying out all of my boards and figuring out what parts I want to make out of which section of a board. Once I make some measurements and cut lines, I head over to the miter saw and start making my rough cuts, which are generally about an inch longer than the final length of my piece. The next step is over at the joiner, where I clean up at least one face and one edge. With all the boards jointed that are going to be used in this project, I head over to the table saw and start cleaning up the opposite edge of the one that was just jointed. By doing this, I'll have nice parallel boards and my glue ups will be easy. So at this point I had the 4 panels laid out and ready to glue up. To glue up these panels, I'm using my 31-inch Bessie parallel clamp, and Bessie Tools is the sponsor of today's project. I've been using their products for several years now. You cannot match their quality, and if you have never tried out Bessie clamps, go check them out. You won't be disappointed. Whenever possible, I always like to stand up my panel glue ups and make sure that the seams have adequate squeeze out. Here I'm using the trigger clamps to laminate stock that will make the rails and stiles for the frame of this nightstand. Now if I'd had 8/4 stock available in this wormy chestnut, I could have omitted this step. Oh well. So once the glue is dried, I take these rails and stiles and joint them on 2 edges. Then I head over to the table saw and cut them down to their final widths. Now over at the planer, I'm bringing down all of the side panels and drawer fronts to their final thickness. Now here's where some real fun begins. I'm using the router table to cut the dados and the rails and stiles. And using my woodpecker's setup blocks, I bring the router bit up to its final height. Before I cut the dados and the stiles, I want to go ahead and cut those down to their final length. The dado in the stile is what's called a stop dado, so I need to know where the router bit begins and ends. That's what I'm doing here. Now, the lines on that piece of tape correspond to the lines on my stile where I need my dado to end. With the router running, I slowly lower the stile onto the bit and then progress through the cut. When I get to the end of my cut, I just back up a little bit and lift the piece off the table. You can see here that those reference lines come in really handy so you know exactly where you're supposed to begin and end your cut. Now for this build, I used my domino as the main joinery method, but if you don't have a domino, no sweat. You can use a doweling jig or even pocket hole screws and still make these. Now I'm not going to talk you through the entire assembly process because, well, you can see it here. But I will give you a couple of tips and pointers as I go along. Now, this reclaimed wood is really brittle. So some of the dominoes were a little bit tighter than others, and in those cases I'm using a trigger clamp to just reinforce that joint as I hammer the domino in place. Now another thing that you may not have seen in this is I'm using these small silicone spheres that are called space balls. They allow the panel to float inside of that dado and not rattle. And the last tip for this panel glue up is I'm using one of the trigger clamps to bring the rails and stiles flush with one another before I put this panel into the parallel clamps to apply some really good pressure while the glue cures. At this point, I've selected which two panels I want to use in each nightstand, and I've labeled them as such. Here I'm starting to lay out additional joinery that will allow me to assemble the rest of this case. For each one of these different positions, I go ahead and just cut one of each joint and then test it and make sure all the measurements are spot on before I proceed with cutting all of the other joints. And you may also know my handy impromptu workbench vise, just stacking two trigger clamps on top of each other, using one to hold one clamp to the bench and the other clamp to hold the workpiece in place. It works out really well. So here we're back on the table saw and we're cutting up some 1/4-inch plywood that will be the back panels for these nightstands. And you guessed it, it's time for some assembly. My approach here is simple. I want to go ahead and get all of the dominoes in the first panel as quickly as possible. Now, all of the domino slots that were cut in the panels were cut on the tight setting. All the domino slots that were cut into the stretchers, those were cut on the loose setting. Now what I'm doing here is I'm actually installing some shims or spacers so that way I can use the 1/4-inch material. Now I had originally planned on using 1/2-inch thick plywood for these back panels, but that's just overkill. So I ended up using these spacers to allow me to use the 1/4-inch plywood instead. With the back panel installed, I now move on to installing the remaining dominoes. And here again, I'm using my Bessie parallel clamps to hold everything in place while the glue cures. Before I set this case aside, I check all of the dimensions one more time just to make sure everything's on point. At this point, I head back over to the planer and I start milling down the tops to their final thickness. With the tops to their final thickness and width, I set up on the ACS and I gang cut both of these tops at the same time. So there are a few ways that you could add this detail on the underside of the tabletop, but I opted to use my router table. Using a helical bit for this cut really produces a fine finish. Now back at the table saw, I'm cutting down 5x5 half-inch thick Baltic birch for the drawer boxes. And here I'm cutting down some 1/4-inch Baltic birch for the drawer bottoms. With a stop block set up on the miter saw, I make quick work of cutting all the drawer sides and fronts to their final lengths. And to assemble these drawer boxes, I'm just going with a simple tried and true pocket hole joinery. And since this is 1/2-inch thick plywood, I'm using the smaller drill and screws. For the drawer slides on this project, I used AccuRide's undermount soft close hardware, and that requires that you cut this little notch in the back of the drawer box. You can certainly use whatever hardware you want, just follow the manufacturer's instructions and you'll be good to go. So here I'm cutting some strips that are going to be installed inside the case, and these will allow for the drawer slides to be mounted. The only detail I'm going to go into with installing the drawer slides in this cabinet is that I use a spacer to set the height of each one of the slides. Other than that, the instructions are really good and pretty self-explanatory. But you also have a visual instruction right here. Let's watch. With the first drawer box installed, I now set a different spacer on top of that drawer box and then again use it as a guide to install the drawer slide. With all the drawer boxes back out of the cases, here I'm cutting slots for the Z-clips that will be used to hold the top down to the case. To help make the feet for these nightstands as similar as possible, I'm using what's called a story stick. And if you've never used one of those, I have another video that explains how to do that linked above. Here I'm drilling for what's called a hanger bolt, and this is how the feet are going to attach to the case. So here I'm marking and drilling for threaded inserts that the feet will be installed into. Now it's time for a little bit of detail work. I assembled these rectangular trim pieces with medium thick Starbond superglue and accelerator, and that's the same way that I attached them to the drawer fronts. So here I'm attaching the drawer fronts one at a time, and I'm using my favorite spacer trick, which is a stack of playing cards. So as you see, I'm using a trigger clamp to hold the drawer front securely to the drawer box, and then I'm pre-drilling, countersinking, and running in some wood screws to hold the drawer front in place. Now I just repeat the process for the remaining drawers. Now in this video I don't actually go over how to install the drawer pulls because I actually did those on site. I had a couple of options for my client to choose from, and I just did not record that step. But if you've hung in there with me this far, I'm pretty sure that you can knock it out. With all the drawer boxes out once again, it's now time to attach the case to the top. And what I'm doing is I'm just centering the case on the tabletop, and then I'm using Z-clips to secure it in those slots we earlier cut with the biscuit joiner. My finish of choice for these nightstands was Rubio Monocoat 2C in the color Pure. So what I'm doing first is I'm using the raw wood cleaner that gets out any of the remaining dust and debris and make sure that I'm going to have a good bond with the finish.
Well, these nightstands turned out absolutely phenomenal and my client was over the moon for them. I hope you really enjoyed the video, and hey, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and if you want to make these nightstands for yourself, make sure to hit the link in the description below and grab the plans.
Oh, you're still there. Awesome. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, I got another one queued up for you right here. And if you want other awesome content from me, check out those. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit the like and subscribe, and until next time, have fun making something.